our military is so effective that we can keep a lid on problems. It can only last if the people in these countries themselves are able to arrive at the kinds of political accommodations and compromise that any civilized society requires.
After authorizing airstrikes in Iraq, President Obama offers a broader insight into his thinking about what U.S. power can accomplish, and we're back now with the panel. George, what have you learned this week, if anything, about Obama foreign policy, about his very grudging willingness to use force and the very strict limits he puts on it?
I think we learned three things from his extraordinarily and alarmingly revealing interview with the New York Times. First, he said he wants a settlement in the Middle East, but in Iraq particularly, where there are no victors and no vanquished. Now, ISIL is not in the realm of splittable differences. They cut people's heads off. They say that the Yazidi have to be exterminated because they're devil worshippers. It's very hard to have a no victors, no vanquished relationship with people like this. Second, he said, we have a strategic interest in pushing back ISIL. Back to where? It's not as though they emanated from some state and are occupying another state. They're home now, and we're certainly not going to push them back with air power. One of the consistent themes of our military experience of the last 100 years is the limitations of air power, no matter how spectacular some of its effects can be. Finally, he said, and this is related, about Russia, he says, we want to go back to a cooperative relationship with Russia. Again, no talk about Russia giving back the Crimea. So again, it's a conceding the advances that our enemies have made and trying to be nice to them.
As George pointed out, the president did an interview with Tom Friedman, columnist for the New York Times, which was very interesting and very wide-ranging. In that interview, he said perhaps his biggest foreign policy regret was in Libya, that we got involved in toppling Gaddafi but didn't have a good answer for what happened next. Take a look at this clip from the president's interview.
I think we underestimated, our European partners underestimated the need to come in full force. If you're going to do this, then it's the day after Gaddafi's gone. So that's a lesson that I now apply every time I ask the question, should we intervene militarily? Do we have an answer the day after?
Jackie, is that sensible caution, or is that paralysis by analysis?
Well, I think he just made Ron's point. I think that's exactly what he said, that he's underestimated, underestimated in Libya. I think one of the interesting things is that the president has largely followed what the American people want on this. They don't want intervention, and yet his polling on foreign policy used to be a huge victory for him. Now it's not. Now it's down low with Obamacare, and it's just striking. They still don't like what he's doing.
You know, Laura, this is not George W. Bush. It's not Ronald Reagan. This is a president who is very cautious about the use of military force after all the problems of the last decade or so. Is that a bad thing?
Well, he ran on getting us out of Iraq and on the tails of public dissatisfaction with the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he won on the fact that he was historic, and he's obligated, he feels, to follow down that path. The problem is reality comes and hits you in the face. And I think Mitt Romney said during the campaign that it's like almost like the president is managing our decline, our economic decline of the middle class, refusal to really engage with Republicans on a lot of issues. And now it seems like that management of our decline has now really seeped into our foreign policy, where with Putin, someone like Putin, I have a great interest in Russia, and that Putin moves into Ukraine, and we're very slow-footed to react. We're going to have some of these sanctions. Sanctions mean nothing. The Europeans have the Nord Stream, the South Stream pipeline going into Europe. That is critical to the lifeblood of Europe. You're never going to get strong sanctions from Europe as long as European leaders know they have to rely on those energy sources. The president doesn't have that strong muscle to go in Europe and say, look, we need you to do this with us. We have a strategic interest in rolling back Russia. We can't just manage our decline with Russia. We can't just say we're going to sit down with Putin and everything's going to be okay. We have to show unity of strength, at least among our allies. But now that's gone away.
In the New York Times interview, the president does talk about Putin and Russia and Ukraine, and he says this. At one point he says he could invade, almost sounding like he's a bystander watching a train wreck happen. Your thoughts about presidential strength and weakness and the use of force and the willingness to use it? Because sometimes, if I may, as somebody who covered Ronald Reagan for 6 years, sometimes, well, to use his line, peace through strength. Sometimes you get more peace if people think that you are willing to use force, and if you do, in fact, do it on occasion.
As someone who covered Bill Clinton and George Bush, I'll say the American people don't want intervention. But the American people also don't want weakness, and they don't want to be attacked. He does have to deal with the world as we have it, not the world as we want it. Three things about that interview struck me. One, you just put up there. He's going to invade? Well, yeah, it's a pretty big deal, Mr. President. What's the next sentence? Two, the comment about no victors and no vanquished. That's a funny thing for a president to say who's overseeing a political system that's all about they can't get over the no victors, no vanquished.
He didn't take that approach in the campaign,
exactly. The White House is all about victors and vanquished. So are Republicans, for that matter. But that's a problem. That's a different issue. Also, Tom's, I thought it was a wonderful interview, but Tom's lead said that the president had, it's clear that the president has a take on the world. I read that story 3 or 4 times. I can't find the president's take on the world. And that, I think, is a problem the American public has right now. That shows weakness. If you can't let us know what is going on and where you're taking us and how you're going to protect us from this new threat.
Thank you, panel. See you next Sunday.